My name is Dan Hughes. I was the webinar trainer from 2009 to 2013, 2014 for Nik Software. I am a faculty member teaching photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology. We are just finishing up our semester. I've got a couple more finals to grade and final projects to give some feedback on. But I'm pretty well geared up for the holiday season. I'm excited as this webinar to me is sort of the doorway. It's sort of the entry into the holiday season. So we're good to go. Merry Christmas to you too, Ed. Thank you very much. We're good to go on our webinar connection. I'm going to go ahead and minimize our Nik Software website there with Santa dancing around. And actually, so today the demonstration is a little bit different because I wanted to talk about making group pictures, in the context of the holiday photographs. But in looking through the images that I had and trying to find photos that were good examples of sort of some of the concepts that I wanted to illustrate to you, general concepts, I will say, and these things are not hard and fast rules, but they're general concepts for trying to make great group pictures, whether they're family photos or friend photos, or even groupings in of let's say presents or food for a still life or something like that. You can actually utilize these same techniques whether you're photographing people or a still life. People are typically a little bit more complicated and complex because you have to direct them, you have to tell them how to put their hands where their shoulders should be, smiles, timing, it gets pretty complex, and that's why I've sort of broken the group portraits or group pictures into small groups and big groups. Smaller groups are typically easier, bigger groups are usually more complex, right? Greater than 5, yeah. And then there's a couple sort of posing techniques that I'll talk to you about. So there's the get-together pose, like this example here, graphic spacing posing. So when I think of that, I think of something like a group picture that Annie Leibovitz might shoot, or images of groups of people that you will oftentimes see in editorials, like in magazines and things, where it's not necessarily just a group of people pushed together because that's what fits into the scene. It's a group of people that have a well planned out kind of background and situation. We'll talk about it. And then there's the good old-fashioned silhouette image, which is a great option because everybody typically looks great in a silhouette as long as you have a sort of graphic sense to the imagery. Now, I am going to move quickly here because I want to talk about the Nik plugins and show you some different techniques, but I think that this is sort of an important foray into what we're getting into with the holiday season. Again, most of these portraits are not holiday-esque portraits, but we can extrapolate. I probably could have photoshopped on a couple hats or something like that onto our subjects here. But we've got a classical, formal kind of composition here. And this is where it's, I would say it's kind of the same as this black and white portrait. We're grouping people together. We're making sure that their heads are visible, their smiles or whatever the emotional response to the camera is going to be is visible. And in this case, it's a nice sense of triangular movement, right? And so group portraits can be difficult because even though there'll be a group of people, the image can look kind of static. And the beauty of this photograph, aside from these wonderful, beautiful smiles and the color coordination and the light, is the fact that the image doesn't look static, right? Each of these young ladies is posing really beautifully, very formally, sort of their posture is straight up, their shoulders are basically straight onto the camera. This is a sort of formal classic portrait. There's just enough environment to indicate environment. And then we've got this triangular shape and movement that go throughout the sort of the heads of the subjects. Moving into a less formal sort of subject, here we've got a family who is just walking towards the camera, and instead of them interacting with the camera directly, they're interacting with each other. In my mind, probably just because of the way that I think, this kind of portrait, it's formal, it's beautiful, it makes for a great framed image, it's easier to shoot as long as you can direct your subjects. This image is more difficult and complex. You're going to have to shoot over and over again if you're going to have the right moment, because there's a graphic sense to the motion and movement of the subjects. We've got enough environment in here to indicate that this is some sort of important space for, in this case, this family. Both of these images, not purposefully, but both of them are lit from behind. So you can see the sun sort of peeking out in the, that is not typical. It just sort of happened with these two examples, but it works beautifully in this case. The subjects are placed in the shadow. The exposure is made for the shadow detail, and a little bit of post-processing is done to sort of clean up the color a little. Again, these kinds of images tend to be a little bit more complex, and you have to shoot 10 or 15 takes of a group walking towards the camera in this same situation, in which case it's easy for people to get tired of their image being made, right? And so this is something that you've got to think about in these kinds of group pictures, is that you have to work with haste and speed, but precision, to make sure that you get the photograph that you want. And so one of the difficulties of making these kinds of images is that you want to and need to show personality of the subjects. The bigger the group gets, the more complex it tends to become. One of the benefits of nowadays shooting digital is that you could, of course, swap heads and faces around, but you want to minimize that if possible and get everything done in camera. Now, the get-together pose. So this is a sort of like formal get-together pose. All of these are, the typical, almost snapshot, not so formal in terms of the dress and garb, right? Not everybody's matching necessarily, but all of these are somewhat formal-looking images, and it's where the photographer has told the subjects to squeeze together to fit into this frame. And so this is also going to indicate, this sense of family and love, right? Hopefully, anyways. And also it's relatively straightforward to tell the subjects what to do. So in the upper right image in this case, you can see there's a lot of personality and a lot of different poses. And so that is a complex image to make with these young ladies, right? So we've got 4, 9, 10, 10 young ladies in this picture. We've got this nice sort of scene. There's just enough space around them to indicate that they're out on a nice hike. And everyone is posing in their own kind of unique way, which is really quite beautiful and can be difficult depending upon who you're photographing. What you'll notice in all of these is that there's a little bit of these personalities come through with the leaning and the headspace, right? So different folks are sort of leaning on each other. Different folks are tilting their heads in different ways. And you're going to find that this is going to be an important facet with the kind of get together pose. And for that matter, any kind of image that you're trying to make relatively dynamic so that there's movement around the photograph, and without having to necessarily tell people exactly what to do. Like if you tell someone to tilt their head a little bit or turn their chin, that's going to be easy for them, as opposed to if you're directing them to do a specific pose. So all of these come together nicely. The last point in this bullet points here, these bullet points here, is the elevation as necessary. So the lower left image there, you've got the young man who's sort of elevated a little bit higher. And so what this is doing is kind of breaking the plane or the line, which is helpful for a little bit more of a dynamic kind of composition. And it also helps to fit more people into the frame, right? So the baby in the upper left image is kind of doing the same thing. And you can think of like a group picture where you might have, I'm thinking of, let's say, like a high school sports picture or something like that, where you've got, subjects laying on the ground, you've got people kneeling behind them, you've got the group of people maybe standing, and then another group of people on apple boxes or possibly standing behind them who happen to be taller, right? What's going to be important with any of these get-together poses is making sure that faces are seen. And I know some of this is probably redundant and you know all of this, but it's hard to think about these things when you're actually out shooting, right? You're saying, Dan, these are all very obvious things. I already know them all, but you've got to have almost like a vernacular and you need to tell people ahead of time that their eyes need to be able to see the camera lens. And if you can do that, you typically aren't going to have to move people around all that much. Now, the graphic space posing. So this is kind of like a more editorial style, a more stylistic kind of group portrait. And all of these things sort of relate. So there's relative space to each person. They have their own space that they're in. In fact, I think I've got a little graphic there. Each person has their own kind of space that they're living within. They have their own kind of unique poses. So that can be more difficult because you've got to direct the subjects unless they know exactly what to do. And some people do, and it's kind of amazing. They'll just get in front of the camera. They'll know exactly what to do and how to sit. And then opposing forces. So this works nicely. We've got the young woman on the bench there sort of engaging with the camera, the man in the upper right sort of side of the frame engaging with the camera. Then the two on the left, the furthest to the left, he's looking off camera. And then the gentleman who's sort of in the center standing in the background, he's looking just over the lens. And so because these folks aren't necessarily engaged with the camera the whole time, you're going to get, or you can get, a kind of more dynamic sense and movement to the image. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't have pictures of everybody engaged with the camera, right? In this case, you can have everybody look into the lens, shoot some pictures, posed however, smiling, straight-faced, you know, not so straight-faced, but maybe angry or having fun or something like that. And then here we can start to direct the subjects to look in other places. And again, what that can do is create, you know, this image is less or has less of a sense of family, and it's more of a produced kind of photograph, but can work really nicely with group images. And you'll see this happening a lot in editorial, and Annie Leibovitz comes to mind, does this sort of stuff all of the time. And in that case as well, the setting in the background needs to sort of lend itself to the scene. And what you'll note with most of these kinds of images is that the backgrounds aren't terribly distracting and there isn't a whole lot going on. In this case, there's actually augmented lighting that's illuminating our subjects, making them slightly brighter and also changing the contrast range of the subjects compared to the background. And that's another thing that's going to help to sort of separate the subjects off of the background in that sense. Now, the last of my slides of the graphic spacing photos. This scene on the left here is sort of a mix of the get-together and the graphic space. You know, we've got these kind of groups of people that can sort of be separated out, if you will. There's a sense of personality. There's a lot of leaning going on, and even the camera looks a little bit off as well, and the framing's a little bit tight in this case. So the whole scene looks. It has its own kind of personality along with the post-processing that's happening there. So I guess all of these topic, subjects, rules, whatever you want to call them that I'm bringing up, they're just things to think about. And if you have an idea of what you want to get as you're posing people, or even better, if you've planned something out with, let's say, developing mood boards, which would be like groups of images that you'd use for inspirational purposes, that can be very helpful so that you can stay focused on the portrait that you want to create. And then if you also have those inspirational images, you can direct the subjects to pose in that way. So mood boards can actually be a really nice sort of thing to do. And then there's the graphic space posing. So in this case, you can oftentimes literally move or leave space for graphics. So I think this webinar is a little bit late, maybe for creating holiday cards, but compositionally, it's a good idea to think about spacing of text and of design purposes. So, you know, the left-hand image there, it would be much more difficult to overlay text. It's a beautiful picture. The composition is very nice photographically. There's a lot of dynamic movement. It almost feels like a classical painting or something along those lines in terms of the groupings of people and how they're formed together. And then the image on the right doesn't have that same sense, but we've left enough space in the top or in the bottom or wherever so that we can include text for those purposes. So that's another thing you want to think about. And the beauty of shooting digitally is that you just recompose the same scene, or possibly if you've got a high megapixel camera, like let's say 16 or 20 megapixels or higher, you can shoot stuff with this much space on the image of the right, but you can end up cropping it if you want a tighter shot to the image on the left. So that's definitely something to think about. I've got a couple more slides with silhouettes, and these are just things to keep in mind for silhouettes. They can be both formal or informal. This silhouette, this jumping silhouette, is sort of a mix of the two, right? Because it's coordinated in a sense, making it somewhat formal, but not because everybody's sort of randomly in the air. The beauty of silhouettes is if you've got a graphic sense, this group is going to know that it's them. They're going to know which one of them is who, and everybody looks great. You don't have to worry about smiles or funny weird faces or compositing heads or anything like that. It is important to have a graphic shape to each individual if possible. And I've got a couple more images that are a little more subdued but still have that sense. The light is driven from behind, and usually you're exposing for the background. So here we've got another, this is again sort of like the beginning of a formal silhouette image made into an informal image. I think the contrast for me is a little bit high, and there's some little technical things that I think could be cleaned up here and there, but it's a beautiful moment that's happening. There's people interacting with each other, hands are being held, arms around each other, really beautiful poses happening. And don't underestimate the silhouette, because it might not be technically the hardest thing to make photographically if you're after that sort of thing, but it's a great thing for a memory, and that's really what we're after for these kinds of holiday pictures. And again, like, none of these necessarily scream holidays, but they all have this nice sense of togetherness that's really quite beautiful. And this is less silhouette than anything, but I guess in my mind, we've got these trees that are framing the subjects, and then we've got these three friends who are not really interacting with each other, but are out on an adventure together. And I think that that's what's going to be a really important facet of a holiday picture, is that people are enjoying each other's time, whether they're on their cell phones or not, and having a wonderful time, on some kind of adventure of sorts. All right, so we're 20 minutes into our webinar. Hopefully that's a good explanation. I'm sure that we've got expert photographers out there who are like, oh yeah, that's very basic, and they've been doing these sorts of things. And maybe we've even got folks out there who want to add to it. If you've got any other general concepts or comments about putting people into groups. We didn't really talk about heights or descending heights or moving people into particular orders and so on, mostly because we only have about 45 minutes and a lot to talk about. But if there's anyone out there who's an expert portrait photographer who wants to just make a point, feel free to type it in. I'll mention who you are, and I'll just mention the point that you're making. Hi, Florin. Nice that you made it. Okay, so there aren't any questions. Doesn't look like there are any problems with our audio connection or anything. So let's go ahead and jump over into Photolab. The next sort of concept that I want to get into, and I've got an image where we've got both a small group of people. We've got Clay Patrick McBride, Sarah, his wife, and Judy. And we'll talk about this and what we can do with this kind of photograph. But I just wanted to mention and talk very briefly about what's going to happen if you go outside and attempt to shoot snow, especially if you're on a program mode in your camera, or even if you're shooting any kind of exposure mode with your camera. Your light meter is likely to lie to you. So in a scene like this, and maybe even a scene like this, the snow throws off, or can throw off, the meter system that's inside of your camera. And what the camera wants to do, what the meter specifically wants to do, is make an exposure, depending upon the way your meter's set up, by the way, make an exposure at 18% gray, middle gray, right? And so what happens, let me go ahead and, I don't actually have any exposures that are terribly underexposed like this. But basically what your camera is going to do is probably something like this. It's going to subdue the tones, textures, and the snow itself. And you're going to get good detail in the snow typically, but your image is going to be underexposed because the light meter is thinking that this is a typical scene. It doesn't understand that there's snow here and that the scene is actually supposed to be probably a lot brighter. And so what you're going to want to do is either kind of do a manual override of the meter. There's numerous ways to do this. So if you're in like a manual exposure mode, you can simply overexpose by a stop or so, 2/3 of a stop to a stop, depending upon the scene, maybe more if necessary. And or use the exposure compensation settings on your camera. Usually there's a dial on the camera that goes from -3 to +3, usually. And what you want to do is bump that up. So you want to go into the positive, generally 2/3 of a stop to a full stop. Now that I'm generalizing here, and what you need to do is, just walk outside, shoot your first exposure, and then you look at the preview, but pay attention to your histogram. And in fact, this histogram is even maybe a little underexposed as well. I probably could have pushed it maybe a 1/3 of a stop, maybe a little bit less than that, if possible. Not really too possible in the camera that I was shooting with. But anyways, you want to make sure that this histogram is pushed as far to the right as possible without overexposing the detail of the scene. So you don't want to lose any of the texture and detail, but you want that pushed over towards the right. And so again, what's going to happen is your camera is going to want to do something like this, and then your image is going to look dark and ruddy, and you're going to have to do more post-processing, and it's likely that you're going to lose some image quality. Whereas if you shoot it properly and just overexpose a little bit, you're going to be able to possibly do less post-processing. You're still going to get the texture out of the snow, which is going to be an important facet of the image, typically anyways, and you're going to be happier overall with the kinds of post-processing that you can do because you've got detail and you've got texture. In fact, let's zoom into this image. So I like the fact that this is just an example photograph of some lines, sort of a formal composition, but there's detail in here. And using the DxO Clearview Plus, which I don't know if it necessarily works for this image, but look at how much texture and detail there is. So I've just checked this DxO Clearview Plus tool on and then off. So this is without, this is with, and so here we're getting this nice sort of sense of light and contrast and texture in these lines. I think if I wanted to get an effect like this, the DxO Clearview kind of effect, on this specific image, I would do it using the control point capability of the local adjustments that you find in the upper right corner here. For now, though, let's jump into this portrait image because it both sort of meets our criteria of being a small group, and then also we have snow in the image. And so the first thing to think about, I'm going to close out my local adjustments. So you want to work in a global to selective kind of process, meaning you do the large, big adjustments that do the overall effects of the image, and then you work from there. So in this case, I actually want to add a little bit of a color adjustment to the photo. So I like the kind of natural white balance that we have, but I'm going to warm the image up just a little bit, just to kind of give a sense of warmth overall to the photograph. So I've just moved into white balance, and I've adjusted that just a touch. And then from there, I think the only stuff that I really need to do is direct your eye as the viewer around the image. We could crop this to make it a little bit tighter, but right now with the current composition, I've got a couple things that I can use this repair tool for. So just to show you this tool, I'm going to go ahead into the details section of DxO's Photo Lab. I'm going to click on the little heal tool, so the little patch tool there. And what we can do is there's a few different settings you can find in the lower left here. You can repair and you can clone. Got both of those options within Photolab 3. And then I can go and just basically mouse mouse over and drag on the stuff that I need to get rid of, right? And so we've got these little extraneous things that I don't want in the frame. I like the subjects back here as well. It's sort of gesture of them is kind of nice. But maybe I don't like the little magenta color that's back there. So what we might do is go and clean that up. So I've resized my brush And I'm going to see if I can get rid of that. So now I still have those people, but I don't have that spot of magenta back there. And again, what we're doing is using the repair tool here in DxO Photo Lab. All right, so I'm going to close that tool by clicking the close button in the right. And then assessing this image, what I want to do is make Sarah's jacket a little less of a kind of like black hole. And I want to direct your attention as the viewer in towards our subjects a little bit more. So to do that, I'm just going to use control points basically, and I'm going to lighten up her jacket a touch. Right? We can lighten it up a lot if we wanted to, but then it's going to look unnatural. So I'm going to lighten it up maybe 3/4 of a stop. Dodge that area a touch. Let's go a little bit more. Full stop. You can get a sense that it was still snowing now that we've brightened up those dark shadows. And I'm just gonna, for anyone not familiar, we're using control points here within DxO. I kind of skipped that part, I'm sorry. And what I did was I dropped a control point on Sarah's jacket. I'm gonna expand this out around her entire jacket and coat. And then in the light section, so you have light, color, and sharpness or detail tools here within the control points in Photolab. And I've just used the exposure adjustment, a little bit of contrast, a little bit of micro contrast, which is going to bring that texture out. It's what's sort of exaggerating the snow that you can see in front of Sarah's jacket. And then the clear view plus, which is also going to exaggerate the snow that's sitting there in front of her jacket. From there, I'm going to click the new mask button, and we're going to throw a control point on Judy the dog. And I want to add a little bit of micro contrast and a little bit of clear view plus. Now, what this is going to do is basically increase the contrast and textures on Judy. And this is a really wonderful way to direct the viewer's attention towards something that you want them to look at. By increasing contrast or increasing texture, the viewer's attention is going to be drawn to that area more. By reducing contrast or reducing texture, the viewer isn't going to pay as much attention because there isn't as much detail. In fact, if I wanted to, and we're not going to leave it like this, but watch what happens if I drop a control point over in this pile of snow and I just start adding a whole bunch of this clear view plus. It's nice because I'm adding texture, but in this case, I don't really want your eye to be directed over towards this pile of snow. I want your eye to be sort of attracted to and directed towards our subjects. So in this case, I don't probably want to add much, if any, of that clear view plus. Although maybe if we darken down the density a little bit and then just increase a little bit of contrast, we can get a sense of the detail that is in the snow without it being terribly distracting. Every time you want to create a new adjustment, you're going to click that new mask button where those control points are. And so that's going to help to that's going to basically create a new control point for you so that you can add your effects wherever you want. So the other thing that I've done back here is I'm just darkening down the scene back here. And then I want to make a new mask on Clay's pants. So I guess what I want to show you is some of the features that are built into these control points. And you're probably getting it now. You've got color adjustment tools, you've got light adjustment tools or density adjustment tools, and then you've got your sharpness adjustment tools. So for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of keep moving here. One point that I do want to make about these control points that are in Photolab, well, 2 points. First of all, one of the major benefits is that we're working with the original raw data if we're dealing with raw photos. In this case, it's a raw photo from a Nikon camera. So now I'm dealing with all of that great information. And it's Pyware, so you can go back and re-edit as you see fit. So let's say we come back to this image in 3 days and say, oh, you know what? I don't really like the control point that we placed over here. You can just click on that control point and delete it at any point. You know, here we haven't clicked out of the image, but basically these control points are saved to this photograph and they're malleable or changeable at any time, which is really quite nice to have, because other solutions, so the rest of like let's say the Nik plugins, you can't really do that unless you're working from Photoshop and you're using a smart filter, smart object capability that the Nik plugins, they do have. But in this case, it's really quite nice because I don't have to deal with giant file structures, I can just jump into Photolab 3, come in and adjust Clay's jacket as I see fit. Adjust Sarah's jacket, maybe add a new mask, and let's dodge Clay's face a little bit. So I'm going to size the area of influence so it's just encompassing his face. I'm going to increase the brightness, maybe just a third of a stop. Let's take a quick look at the before and after as I click the close button in the lower left corner there. And here we have the original image, which is fine. It's a little bit linear, a little bit flat, and I know where to look because of the subject, right? But we've enhanced the image relatively subtly, and it's now directing the viewer's attention towards our subject a lot more. Warmed up the image, increased some saturation on Clay, and made his jacket a little bit more green, brightened up her jacket, added a little contrast to Judy, and now we've got this nice sort of simple family portrait of these three folks here. All right. So moving past some of the technical bits that we've got within Photolab, let's talk about sort of conceptual processing, and that is the beauty of the group portrait, especially for holiday purposes, is that you can experiment more with the filter set that maybe you use. So in my professional work, I tend to not use overly stylistic effects. But if I'm going to be shooting a group portrait for a family, or this, coming Christmas, I'm going to be shooting at least 2 family portraits because, of course, I am mitigated as the family portraitist, which is fine. It's great. I like taking pictures, and I love taking pictures of my family. I'm able to have a little bit more fun with these kinds of family group holiday pictures than I am otherwise. So what I want to do is take this image into Efex Pro 4, which is, for anyone not familiar, a collection of 55 filters, and it's one of the Nik suite. So again, I know that there are folks out there who are well versed in the Nik collection, and maybe some folks who've never really opened it or saw it before, and this might be their first time. We are launching from Photolab. I'm going to go ahead and click right onto Efex Pro 4, and as that launches, I'm just going to mention the fact that you can use the Nik collection with any piece of photographic editing software that will accept a Photoshop plugin, or if you're using Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom, or Photolab. There are other pieces of software out there. I tend to think more in the Adobe realm, and then also in Photolab sense, because now I'm using it all of the time as it was included in the purchase of the software, which is a really nice facet. Now, long story short, what's going to happen when we're done with this image, I'm going to go ahead and just bring this down. What's happened, if you look at Photolab, I had an original image, and then what we've done is we've duplicated the original image, and we've got what our filter set is going to be applied to. So we're never actually touching the original pixels. It's always going to be duplicated. That's going to work the same way in Lightroom. So if you're an Adobe Lightroom user, it's going to work exactly the same way. And then if you're in Photoshop, you're going to be working with layers and layer masks. So in Photoshop, you have the ability to save just one image that would be opened into Photoshop, and then you can save those as layers as well, which is a nice feature depending upon what you're after. So we're in Efex Pro 4. This is our grouping of 55 different filters. There's a whole slew of different kinds of things that you can do, and different combinations, millions of different combinations of filters that you can put together. So I don't find myself using the Film Effects Faded or Film Effects Nostalgic or Film Effects Vintage all that often. But the beauty of the group family portrait or holiday portrait is that you can play a little bit more. And I love what happens with this Film Effects Nostalgic feel. Now, each of these different filters has its own filter set and slider set. In this case, we have a brightness adjustment, which I don't think we need to brighten the image. It's already a relatively high key photo. You have a perceptual saturation slider, which is a really beautiful saturation adjustment that's built into several of the filters here within Efex. A glow slider, right? So we can increase or decrease the glow. I'm going to show you a trick with that as well. And then a vignette tool, grain per pixel, so we can add or remove grain as we see fit. And then the film strength slider. So if you take your film strength slider to the left, it's going to reduce the film application. So we've got nothing. If you bring it up to 100%, you're going to have a ton of this film type applied on the photograph. Now, clicking into the film type uh, pop-up menu here, or drop-down, basically you can scroll over each of these different film types, and you can get a sense of the different kinds of nostalgic film types that are built into the software here. And in my case, I really like what's happening with number 10, but I've turned my film strength up to 100. It's way too high, so I'm going to reduce this to make it a little bit more subtle. Right now at 50%, I really like what's happening. If we wanted some grain, we could put it on there, but I want to show you a trick with this kind of filter. So I'm going to put the film strength at about, actually, let's reduce it a little more to make the trick a little more obvious. I'm going to get rid of the vignette so that there's no vignette applied by this filter. And I'm going to increase the glow just a little, just to kind of soften the feel of the image. From here, what I want to do is add another filter. So we're gonna button the Film Effects Nostalgic filter up. I'm going to click Add Filter, and we're actually going to add Film Effects Nostalgic a second time. And it sounds crazy, but now we can actually apply kind of two different Film Effects Nostalgics, or two almost exactly the same Film Effects Nostalgic filters. As I go to what were we on, number 10. But in this way, I can selectively add the effect where I want it to be. So in this case, I want to bring my film strength down. Actually, let's increase it. Let's bring it up to maybe 60%. I'm going to get rid of the grain again. I'm going to get rid of the vignette again. The perceptual saturation is doing some interesting stuff. I'm going to reduce the brightness. Actually, let's go ahead and bring the brightness down. And so just to get a sense of what's happening, let's turn off the two filters. This is the straight image, and now looking at it, it's a little bit cool and a little bit flat. And as we add the first Film Effects Nostalgic, we're doing that. Right? One more time, the before and the after. Now I've added Film Effects Nostalgic a second time. This time we're going to use control points, and we're only going to apply the Film Effects Nostalgic in certain areas. So I love what's happening with this second application in the background of the image. So we're going to take a plus control point, and we're just going to stick it in the background, right? And what these control points do, for anyone who's not familiar, is in color effects, a plus control point is going to put the effect in the area that you click and drop the control point, and a minus control point is going to remove the effect, right? So with this second application of film effects, I want the effect in the background with this, like really strong glow and this really kind of interesting effect going on in the background, but I don't want it so much on our subjects. So I've duplicated a bunch of plus control points. I did that very quickly. I'm sorry. The way that I did that is I held the Option key down on my Mac and then just clicked and drag. So Option, click and drag to drag it away. So if I want a duplicate of a control point, I hold Option on a Mac or Alt if I'm on a PC, click and drag. There are a few other ways of actually creating duplicate control points. One of the other ways is to use copy and paste if you've got an active control point. So this is an active control point, the one where you can see the sliders and adjust opacity and the size. And you just hit Command C on a Mac or Control C on a PC, and then Command V on a Mac. And what that's going to do is give you an exact duplicate of your control points. And I'm just going to put my minus control points on our subjects here to kind of make sure that we're getting rid of that second application of the Film Effects Nostalgic. And I'm going to put a little bit on her and on the background. So now that we've removed the effect from our subjects' faces, but we've added this extra, let's even increase the glow some more. I just need to be careful of exactly where I'm applying it. What we're going to do is finish this image off with what looks to be a vignette. I'm just kind of like peppering the image with control points to remove the effect where we don't want it to be. Let's take a quick look at the before and after. We'll do a side-by-side in this case. So, and I'm going to hide all of these windows. If you hit the Tab key on your keyboard, it'll hide everything for you. So on the left is the original, on the right is the enhanced, and we've kind of got it to come alive. And again, we're able to use filters that I wouldn't usually use on most images, although this is a beautiful result, so it works nicely. I'll scroll over the top up here so we don't have to see the control points on the image. The last thing that I want to do is, again, sort of direct your eye as the viewer towards the center or towards our subject. And the quickest way to do that, and in my mind, one of the most beautiful ways, is to use the darken, lighten, center filter. And this is the filter that I do use on all sorts of photographs that I'm trying to direct the viewer towards the center or towards a particular area in an image, because it creates this kind of sleight of eye trick. So what it wants to do is darken the border of the image and lighten the center in a way that is going to be more of a sleight of eye trick than, let's say, a vignette, where a vignette that we apply can usually work and it's very, very beautiful, but you can see that it's being applied on the image. Here, we can see it as we turn it on and off. There's off, there's on. But in real life, if we were to see a print of this, you wouldn't really know that that's been filtered. It just looks like the light is kind of doing that. All that said and done, one last look at the compare button. Here's the original image. Here's the enhanced image. I'm actually going to go one last step here, and I'm going to reduce the film strength just a little bit, because I liked what was happening and it made an obvious effect change between the two, but I think it was a little too strong. And we're going to click the save button in the lower right corner. As that's saving, I'm going to open up the GoToWebinar control panel. Doesn't seem like there are any questions coming in, so we'll keep moving. Is everyone still there? Can you still hear me and can you still see the screen? Because I haven't had any questions that came in a while, so I just want to make sure everything's still good to go. Okay, cool. Thanks, everyone. Melody, Arthur, Jill, Bob, Andy, I appreciate it. Thank you. Cool. Okay, so we've got our original image. We're back here in Photolab. Exact same thing would happen if you're a Lightroom user. You'd have your original image, and then saved right next to the original image, you'd have your enhanced image. So you can see the difference between the two, 1 and 2. All right, so we've got a couple minutes left. Let's jump into one of these sort of more holiday food images, sort of like a still life photograph. I love this image because it's simple and it's a still life that almost anybody can do. The same here, and actually oddly enough, the composition's almost identical in terms of the area that's in focus and even the things that are sort of being imaged, these holiday-esque things. This photograph is not necessarily more complex, but it's harder to get this vantage point without specialized equipment, right? Because this is sort of a top-down image. You've got to be able to mount the camera up above, or you've got to be able to stand on something so that you can get this wonderful, beautiful light, but still get the effect that you want. This top down. Here, a simple tripod could be done or could be used. So if you're anything of a baker or you're making cookies, that actually works really nicely for holiday images and holiday cards as well. And you know what? It is maybe a little bit late for this season to shoot images and to get them out, at least in a printed form, but you can still share your photography with friends and family via email, unless you've got a home printer, in which case you could maybe make some prints as well. It makes for really lovely gifts. I am actually headed into a studio after we do this webinar to make 10 to 15 prints for family members, just because, you know, again, I'm kind of the family photographer, and it's an easy way for me to share my pictures and my love and passion for photography with my families, to make some really beautiful prints. That's a different conversation though. For now, let's play around a little bit with this image and in color effects. So I hope to get through this image and then talk about using Analog Efex Pro, which is another of the Nik suite, really beautiful piece of software. And because we can, in my mind anyways, we have sort of permission, if you will, to more heavily stylize these images, Analog Efex Pro works really nicely in that case, because you can control these highly stylistic filter effects using Analog Efex Pro. In this case, let's see, I wanted to use the cross process filter. Another one of my absolute favorite filters here within Color Efex. It's a very simple filter. There's just a drop-down method in the upper right corner of this interface here, and then a strength slider. And what I tend to use is L02 and L03 because of the contrast adjustment and then the little bit of funky color that happens on the photograph as you change it. So the idea of this filter is that we are emulating what would happen if you were to cross-process film in the, if you will, kind of wrong chemistry. So in this case, you can see where it's labeled C41 to E6. C41 is color negative film for the most part. E6 is positive chrome film. And what this is emulating is if we were to take a negative film and process it as if it were in a chrome film. Down at the very bottom, this is E6 to C41. So this would be the effect of taking chrome film and then actually processing it using C41 chemistry. They're all really quite nice. The ones that I tend to land on, again, I'm generalizing here, are L02 and L03. And what I like so much about it is the contrast and the little skew of color that happens. So if we look at the side by side in this case, let's hide these. On the left is the original, on the right is the enhanced, and this is just what that one particular setting does really beautifully. It opens up these textures and details, and it kind of cleaned up the contrast in a nice way. So let's hide that. I've increased the filter strength. I think there's a little bit too much of the application right here on the bread. It just seems a little bit too bright, so I'm going to take a minus control point. I'm going to size that down, and then I'm going to increase the opacity, but not to 100%. In fact, just to show you, I'm going to delete this control point, so it's active. I'm going to hit the delete key to get rid of it. If I take the minus control point from the right side, place it on the bread there in the foreground, that's going to remove this cross-processing filter entirely from that area. I don't want to do that. I just want to reduce some of the effect. So I'm going to bring that opacity up to maybe 25%. Just to kind of guarantee that I have the full effect on the bread here, I'm going to take a plus control point from the right side of the interface, and I'm going to place it on this part of the bread. And then I'm just going to toggle my filter on and off to make sure I'm getting what I want. In the long sort of form of doing this, if I wanted to be more precise, I could open up into the control points section here, and we could actually turn on the selections of these control points, right? So control point 1, which is this first control point that we used, if I turn that on, what this is indicating to us is that we are removing some of the effect from any of this area that's sort of gray, right? In fact, if I take my opacity down to 0, you can see it kind of cleans up my selection. In fact, what we're doing is we're looking at kind of the instant selection that this control point makes. As I click and drag it around, you can see as it changes. It's really, really quite amazing. So I'm going to take this minus control point, place it there on that slice of bread, and I'm just going to bring my opacity back to about 25. Again, all this is doing is showing me where the filter is being applied and where it is not. Anything that is completely white has the full filter effect to it. Anything that is gray has some of the filter effect applied to it. Anything that's totally black wouldn't have any of it. So if I place a minus control point back there, you can see as it moves it around. I don't want to do that in this case. If anything, I actually want to place a plus control point and add the filter effect back into the top of that part of the bread. Now I want to turn the control point mask off, so I'm going to move back to the right side into the control point list and turn that off. And then we're going to finish this image using the classical soft focus filter. So again, this is a highly stylistic filter. I'm sure some folks out there use it pretty often. I don't find a great use for this filter most of the time, but what it can help us to do here is create an open, kind of airy filtering effect, and it kind of blurs the image in a beautiful, interesting, non-optical way. So we still have the sharpness of the edge, but it kind of creates this subtle glowing effect. I've clicked on the drop-down menu. We've gone to diffusion setting number 3, and then I'm going to just bring my diffusion of detail all the way up, bring my strength all the way up. We're probably not going to leave it here, but just so that I can show you what this filter is doing. Here's the before, nice and sharp. Here's the after. It's beautiful. It can be subtle. It's going to be more subtle. The first thing I want to do, though, is remove this filter effect from the areas where I know I do not want it. So I don't want it in the areas that I want tack sharp. So I'm going to just take minus control points and I'm going to remove it from those areas. And then I'm going to take plus control points and I'm just going to throw them into the areas that these minus control points may be affecting. And I'm going to kind of, oops, that's a minus. I'm going to make sure that I like the effect by turning the filter on and off. So there's the before, there's the after. Notice how I'm going to zoom in a couple times. So I'm hitting Command plus. Let's just toggle this on and off. Let's hide some of these windows. Move the navigator to the left by clicking and dragging it. Here's the before. Here's the after. We can probably hone these selections in a little bit more. Oops, I wanted a minus control point. I want to make sure the stuff that I want in focus is in focus still, and I'm not losing detail and texture in the areas where I want detail and texture. But it does have this really beautiful, subtle, to me, holiday-esque effect. Now, if it's not doing exactly what you need, you can, of course, move through your different filter settings and hone those in. I think I do want to just decrease the strength a little bit, maybe to 70%. And then in this case, let's go ahead and use that not dynamic skin softener, the darken, lighten, center filter. We're going to change the shape of the darken, lighten, center filter. And in this case, rather than darkening the border, let's lighten the border. So usually the way that I apply darken, lighten, center is I'm trying to direct your attention towards the center by darkening the border. In this case, the subject is not dark necessarily, but is sort of the darkest part of the frame. And by taking the border luminosity up and to the right and maybe leaving my center luminosity at 0, now we've got an even more open and kind of glowy photograph, and it's subtle at the same time. But in my mind, I'm using these filters that I don't typically use. I'm going out of my comfort zone and I'm kind of having fun with this post-processing. Let's take one last look at the before and after. On the left is the original. On the right, we've opened up these areas and details in this really nice, subtle way. We've applied it specifically where we want it to be using control points, and I'm pretty happy with the result. So I'm going to click that save button in the lower right corner. It brings us back over into our host software, and we've got our original image and then our enhanced image in the scene. All right, so we've got a whole bunch more pictures to take a look at, not enough time to do it. So let's take a look at a snapshot image that we could hypothetically turn into maybe a holiday card or something like that. So this is, in my mind, sort of the least kind of produced image. This is, it's just an image of somebody's door, basically, with this nice holiday decoration overall. As opposed to looking at this photograph, which took a lot of time to style probably, and then this image, which again, it's usually using specialized equipment to get the picture, let alone having to have the ability to cut these out with cookie cutters, although lots of folks probably have both of those things. This is a relatively straightforward image. Anybody could shoot this with a cell phone, but we can turn it into something completely different using Analog Efex Pro. So using all sorts of software, I'm sure, but in this case, let's take a look at what Analog can do. As that launches, I'm going to take a look at our GoToWebinar control panel. We're good. Okay. And I see, Martin, you've got a question there. I'll handle that, once we get through this image, if possible. Well, definitely will be possible, but once we're sort of through the demonstration portion. All right. We're in Analog Efex Pro. Analog Efex Pro emulates different kinds of classical camera film aberrations and problems. And what this amounts to are these really beautiful sort of stylized photos. Right now, we're in the classic camera tool, but to use this this set of filters and set of kind of tool combinations, you click in the upper left corner. If you like classic camera, you could actually just click on these different presets. But what we're going to do is click on the camera itself in the upper left corner. And then you can choose from the 11 different tool combinations, sort of these 10 that are different kinds of cameras, and then the En Vogue camera as well, which is a set of presets that I developed for Nik software early in this year. and it's just a different combination of looks. And they don't necessarily have a rhyme or reason, but they all have their own kind of interesting look and feel that's different than what was originally built into the software. So I've just clicked on this double exposure one. I want to show you another way of using the software, because you can use the software like this, that is choosing the camera and then choosing a preset from the camera. But my favorite way to work, if I've got a little bit of time and I know, what I'm after, is to actually use the camera kit, which is your ability to add or to adjust the different filters, right? In fact, just to be clear and concise with what we're talking about, I've clicked on the double exposure tool or camera setting from the En Vogue set of settings, and the double exposure filter is using basic adjustments, double exposure, photo plate, and film type. If I move into my camera kit, I can actually turn these different things on and off by clicking the plus or minus button. That's to the right of the different filter that you might want to use. And what we want to use in this case, or in my mind, is the bokeh or bokeh filter. And the light leaks, let's turn that one on. And then the lens vignette, maybe even frames. Let's go ahead and just turn that one on. Now, once I've turned on the different filters that I want to use, I typically go from the top down, because if I'm turning these filters on, I'm probably going to want to go hone them in pretty specifically. And one of the differences between analog effects and the rest of the Nik plugins is that different filters actually will have different on-image controls. So this focus filter, the bokeh or bokeh filter, actually allows us to place the center point, which is going to be totally in focus, and then there's a gradient from the inner circle to the outer circle, and then anything outside of the outer circle is going to have the bulk of the effect, the blur strength that you've got on the image, right? So you can add as much or as little as you want. I'm going to add more than we need right now to kind of create a placement of our effect. And so, if you wanted this much blur, you could just leave it like this, and now we've got a really kind of interesting image, and we've created space for graphics. So if this were going to be a holiday card, now we have some space for text. Whereas before, if I brought my blur strength down, there's really no place to put the text because there's so much frequency, there's so much texture and stuff to look at. Simply by blurring this way, we're able to get a nice set of area for text and type and things. Now, boost highlights. If we didn't want to boost the highlights, we can bring that down. I like a little bit of that in this case. And then one of the important facets here is you can actually change the shape of the aperture. So here may be the wrong holiday with the hearts, but you can change this to different pointed stars, and you can rotate those stars or rotate the aperture. You can see in this area, I'm looking specifically in the sort of areas where these specular highlights are happening. I'm going to click and hold the compare button. So you see a flash or some sort of super bright light is being reflected here in some of these areas. As we blur those areas, they are now taking on the shape of that particular aperture. So this is a nice effect, and you can change that based upon which of these aperture shapes you're choosing. So I'm going to stick with one of those stars because that seems really festive, and then I'm going to increase the blur strength just a touch more, getting a nice feel out of that. And then from there, we're going to turn on light leaks. In light leaks, I'm going to click on the crisp from the drop-down menu, and we're going to basically just choose one of these interesting light leaks. And I like the crisp in this case because it doesn't throw off my contrast all that much. You can see you can move the light leak around as well. And what I like about this in this case is it creates a sense of depth to the photo by adding in the light leaks, by adding in the frame and the lens vignette. We're basically able to add another sense of dimension to the picture, whereas in this case, this photograph is primarily two-dimensional, right? It's basically just the photograph of the stuff on the door, right? There isn't a lot of foreground, middle ground, background. And so by adding in the lens vignette and by adding in the light leaks and maybe even the frame, what we're getting out of this is something that has a little more depth to it. It's a very easy picture to make in the sense of this could exist anywhere, and the light is exactly how it is in the scene, in the frame. But by adding in the blur effect, our light leaks, the lens vignette in the frame, now we've taken an image that was not so dynamic and made it into something that has some alternative or different uses. I actually am going to add in my basic adjustments and just boost the contrast a little bit. I want there to be a touch more contrast, and then a little bit more saturation. And then we'll click the save button in the lower right corner. And that's using Analog Efex Pro to restyle the image overall, really. So we've got our original picture and then our enhanced picture here within our film strip. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I've gone over time on our hour. I've got plenty more to talk about, but I'm going to cut it off there. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. I hope you have a really fantastic holiday season. I will be back doing webinars, hopefully in February. I don't know if I'm going to have any webinars in January. We'll see. So have a great season. Hopefully I'll see you back. If there are any questions, feel free to type them into the questions box. But if you don't want to stick around for the Q&A, feel free to go. Hopefully this has been beneficial to you. We talk a little bit about portraits. It's hard to talk about portraits in this way because all I can do is show you images and sort of talk about the sense of doing it. It's way easier to teach and to talk about portraiture when you've got a group of people and you are with me or you are with an instructor discussing and talking about how to do that stuff. I don't have the ability to do that via these webinars aside from showing some slides. So hopefully that's beneficial. Martin had a question about determining whether a control point is a plus or a minus control point using color effects. So let's take a look. The easiest way to tell if it's a plus or minus control point is actually how far the opacity slider is out, Martin. There's no easy way, there's no like indicator or difference indication of a plus and minus control point. So I'm going to minimize my GoToWebinar control panel. Let's tab to get our stuff back. So I guess what I'm getting at is a plus control point has this really long opacity slider, and the minus control point is going to have a short opacity slider. When they're not active, they are identical. But if you click on it, you can say, oh, yep, that's a minus control point, or that's a plus control point. And the reasoning behind that is because a plus control point can turn into a minus control point, right? It's basically the difference is a minus control point's default setting is a 0% opacity, where a plus control point's default setting is 100%. So there's no indication which one's which aside from that. And then if you move into your control points list, you can tell because anything that's white is going to have the filter applied to it, and anything that's black does not, right? So those are the two ways probably to tell which is which. All right, so let's jump back over into GoToWebinar. Hopefully that's helpful, Martin. Cool. Wonderful. It doesn't seem like there's any more questions coming in. So have a really fantastic holiday season, ladies and gentlemen. Bart, fantastic. I'm glad that you've learned a lot. I wish you guys happy holidays as well. There's a lot of folks that have come back to these webinars whenever they could, and I greatly appreciate that. It's really wonderful to see you in these webinars. Happy holidays to you and yours, and I hope to see you again soon. Thanks a lot, everyone.